Mr. President.
The Senator for Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. President. Here's what's happening. Last night, Senate Democrats asked to do a one-day continuing resolution. They also asked to do a three-day continuing resolution. What does that mean? That means that we were at an impasse because the House passed continuing resolution was 4 weeks, and that was not acceptable to the 60 to enough United States senators to pass. So you subject it to a vote, it doesn't get cloture, it fails. Under normal circumstances, then you try to find out what might be able to get cloture. But we were so close to the deadline that we needed something called a unanimous consent request. In other words, we needed every single United States senator to accede to the idea that we should vote on something. And it's not unusual for a unanimous consent to be granted. A lot of times it's just perfunctory stuff, everyday stuff, to kind of move something in the schedule or allow someone to have 10 more minutes to speak or whatever it may be. But on big things, you don't always grant consent. I get that. But think about where we were last night. We were at the precipice of the government shutdown, and Senator Nelson from Florida asked for unanimous consent, in other words, all 100 United States senators agreeing to bring up a measure that would have kept the government open. The idea being, that's better than a shutdown. The idea being, everybody on the Senate floor was actually behaving like a senator last night that did not want to shut the government down. There were lots of very interesting, constructive, productive, bipartisan conversations. We were close. We weren't that close. We weren't 10 minutes away, but we weren't so far apart that it wasn't worth trying. And that's why Senator Nelson said, why don't we buy ourselves another 24 hours and not shut the government down? But the majority leader objected. Had that been subjected to a vote, and it was the majority leader's prerogative to allow it to be voted on, had that been subjected to a vote, I doubt there would have been more than a handful of people voting against it. Nobody wants a government shutdown. Senator Nelson provided the opportunity for us to avoid this. And then Senator Tester said, okay, maybe one day's too short. Maybe we can't get this done in 20. My view was we should have 12-hour CRs. We should have absolute burning pressure on ourselves. It should be physically miserable. We should be here. We should be working. We should be negotiating. That's my view. I think we should be on 12-hour CRs. I don't think people who even, listen, I can't go home, right? I live pretty far away. But even those who live on the Eastern Seaboard, I don't think anybody should be comfortable this weekend. Politically, physically, mentally, to understand what's happening to the country, you should not be comfortable. You should be embarrassed. And so I think we should be on 12-hour CRs. Okay, 24-hour CR, I was fine with that. That got rejected. How about a 3-day CR? Which was, by the way, what President Trump wanted to do, to try to close a deal. But those were rejected. And no one can explain to the public why we can't keep the government open for a few days to negotiate without punishing the whole country. Nobody wins during a shutdown. We were so close to an agreement. But the overarching reason why that we didn't reach the agreement is that we have an erratic White House. And I've been trying to dial down my rhetoric in this context. I'm looking at the presiding officer who is a Republican with whom I have a constructive working relationship. And if we're going to get out of this, we have to get out of this together. So I'm trying to watch my tone here, because we're going to have to vote on something together at some point. But the simple fact is that the White House has been erratic and inconsistent in this process. There was at least the framework for a deal on January 11th, and it got blown up in that very famous meeting with the expletives. And then there was at least the framework for a deal yesterday, and it got now very famously blown up by a subsequent meeting and a subsequent phone call. And here we are with 4 continuing resolutions in 4 months. We haven't been actually able to do the appropriations process, and we haven't done great with appropriations in the past since I've been here 5 years, but occasionally we'll get an omnibus done, occasionally we'll have proper markups, occasionally we will look at each executive agency and do our job properly. It's not the regular order like it used to be with my predecessor and many of the people of the Senate of old, but it's not as bad as this. A CR, month by month, week by week, enough is enough. And instead of trying to deal with this, the White House is failing to address these baseline issues and then creating new crises. This was a manufactured crisis on DACA. They didn't need to create this crisis, but now we have one. And instead of using the executive's authority to solve problems, they're focusing on the wrong things. They are punishing children who were brought to this country through no fault of their own, and now are as American as anyone in Congress, except in the eyes of the law. But there's a level of inconsistency, as a euphemism, that we've had to deal with in these negotiations. The White House told the Republicans to fund CHIP as part of a 30-day spending bill, and then the president tweeted that we should only fund CHIP if it's part of a long-term solution. We had a deal on the table to help Dreamers in exchange for border funding, only to have the White House change its mind. That happened once when the deal was blown up a couple of weeks ago and yesterday. So Senate Republicans may feel comfortable, they may feel uncomfortable, I don't know. I think it probably depends on the member. But they are in a holding pattern waiting for presidential leadership. And they don't know what the White House wants. And they don't want to move on legislation without White House approval, but trying to get clarity from the administration on this or any other issue is a fool's errand, because it changes by the hour and certainly by the day. And that's why we're in this position. Now, it's not unusual for Congress to have disagreements between the parties, within the political parties, between House and Senate. That's the way the legislative process works. It's a messy process. But the way an executive is supposed to play that role, is supposed to wield that authority, that power, whether it's a governor or a mayor or a president, is that when it gets close, and we were close, the executive is supposed to close the deal. And this executive does the opposite. This executive has blown up every deal, every time. Sometimes we're far apart and it gets worse. Sometimes we're vanishingly close and it gets blown up. But what an executive is supposed to do is play that role, is play that adult in the room. Right now, we are a ship without a captain. That's why we're marking the one-year anniversary of this administration with a government shutdown. That's why hundreds of thousands of people across the country are marching to say that they are dissatisfied with the direction of this country. In the year 2017, in this United States Senate, it was a unique year, and that is because we had basically no bipartisanship on the Senate floor. There were a few things that went by unanimous consent, and the process of the United States Senate is supposed to be you stick a bill on the floor, and it takes a week or two. Everybody offers amendments. There's lots of haggling. It's kind of messy. People talk too long. People argue. But in the end, you move a piece of legislation. And it's a bipartisan process by construct. We are supposed to be different than the House. We're not a majoritarian institution. We're supposed to be a moderating force on the country. We're supposed to be the adults in the room. And the way you do that is through an open amendment process. But I want everybody to know that we had a couple of situations where Democrats were allowed to offer amendments, but that was in something called vote-a-rama. And I know the presiding officer hates vote-a-rama. I know most people in the United States Senate hate vote-a-rama. Why? Because it's a farce. It is like worse than student council. Everyone is just doing stuff to position themselves back home. None of the things that we vote on in the vote-a-rama process have any force of law or are going to be enacted. There is nothing meaningful that happens in vote-a-rama. Other than that, not one single solitary Democratic amendment was considered on the United States Senate floor. No Democratic senator had their amendment considered on the Senate floor except inside of the process called vote-a-rama, which we all know is a farce. And so we haven't had bipartisanship, and I was so encouraged when the majority leader earlier this year, first week of the year, I think, right before convening, said he wants to do things on the basis of 60 votes, which is the way the Senate has always worked. And I know he considers himself an institutionalist. And I understand that they felt an imperative to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act and do their tax cuts via the reconciliation process, which is a 51-vote threshold. But he basically announced, we're going to do bipartisan stuff this year. But what we have is an erratic administration that changes its position every hour, and so it's very, very difficult to get to 60. They lack the clarity, they lack the capacity, and it appears they lack the desire to govern in a bipartisan fashion. So I just want to be really clear. Democrats are ready and eager to talk. We are here to find a way forward, but that does require presidential leadership. I don't understand why we couldn't have a one-day CR, a two-day CR, a five-day CR. I don't understand why we can't negotiate with the government open. Why can't, when Bill Nelson comes down to the floor and says, why don't we buy ourselves another 24 hours so that civilian DOD employees can get paid, so people at the Pearl Harbor shipyard can get paid, so people who work for the federal government can get paid, so some of the people who work in the United States Congress, in security and elsewhere, and parking, all of these wonderful civil servants are not going to get paid, and all these services are going to be shut down tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but Monday morning, because nobody even is going to allow Bill Nelson's proposal to even get a vote. You guys don't want to do a 24-hour CR? Vote against it. But at least allow us to keep the government open and keep these negotiations open. Now is the time for Congress to conduct itself as the Article I branch, as a separate, co-equal branch of government. And we are not in a position, I understand the politics. I mean, we just had 8 years of President Obama, and obviously Democrats were very eager to understand the administration's position so we could calibrate and coordinate. We didn't always do the same thing, but you got to keep an open ear to what a president of your party desires to do. But when a president of your party either is totally unclear or changes his mind every 12 hours, then you have to make a judgment that you're going to exercise your constitutional obligation and get the job done with his participation or over his objections. And that's what we need to do on a bipartisan basis. I yield the floor.